Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining. I am incredibly excited to be speaking with my dear friend and psychologist. I always get those two confused. Joelle Anderson. Welcome, Joelle.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So a bit about Joelle. Well, I've known her for years. I mean, close to probably 8 years now. On a personal level, we've been buds and, done cool things like Muskoka hangouts and backyard hangs and, birthday parties and all this cool stuff. And I decided to work with Joelle as a client in her mindfulness meditation program. And that's where I learned a ton about what was happening in my head. And it was an 8-week course. And I think I did it twice, didn't I? Yeah, I did it twice.
Mm-hmm.
Took so much from it. So since then, Joelle has become, she's opened up her practice. So I'll tell you, her full bio here. Joelle Anderson is a registered psychotherapist, and she's working north of Toronto. So she's got a private practice in Uxbridge, and she also works in 2 other local clinics. Right now, everything's online because of COVID, but she's treating a variety of mental health issues, including trauma, anxiety, and depression. She has a specialization in the treatment of eating disorders and other maladaptive forms of coping for dealing with mental health issues. Got my words mixed up. Joelle also has a diverse work experience in a variety of therapeutic contexts, from being a counselor at Georgian College to being a clinician at Bellwoods Health Services. When she's not working, Joelle loves to spend time outdoors in nature, loves camping, yoga and meditation, and dabbles in many arts and crafts. So that's Joelle in a nutshell.
So weird to hear it on a page.
Isn't it?
Yeah.
Oh my God. So I was just telling her before we started this recording that I've been so eager to talk to Joelle about mental health. And, there's a lot of different people that I could be speaking to about mental health for a million different reasons. But the thing that I've always loved about learning from you or conversing with you is I receive you to have this really diplomatic, non-judgmental, self-loving, self-compassionate, almost maternal way of inviting people to look at themselves and the world in a way that I find very empowering. And you seem to, over the years, you just drop these little nuggets. You'll just drop this little thing, and I'm like, I'll hold on to it for years, and it really helps. So how is that, hearing that?
I'm humbled. This is where I'm okay, receiving energy, try to be gracious. Holy cow. It's very kind of you. Thank you.
It's the truth though, it's the truth. So I was waiting for the ask, what is my ask? What is the topic that I want to unpack with you? And I reached out and gave you a few different things that I wanted to unpack today. And your response was great. So I'm really, really eager to jump in. Obviously, May is Mental Health Awareness Month, and I am currently raising funds for CAMH Hospital here in Toronto. And the whole purpose is to help to break stigmas around mental health. I, as a human being, I don't love stigmas, but especially because I have struggled with mental illnesses throughout the whole course of my life. Stigmas is what really kept me stuck in a shame cycle for a really long time and not asking for help. Mm-hmm. So, speaking to these points with really just coming at it from a matter-of-fact place where this is the way it is for some people, and these are the things that we can do to help. Let's take the shame, let's take the stigmas out of these conversations, right? So,
yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That'd be great. Let's keep working on that.
Yeah. The first question I wanted to ask you was, can we talk about addiction and mental health?
We sure can. I assume you want more of an answer than that, though. Yeah. Addiction and mental health. Addiction and mental health often come hand in hand together. Of course, not always. There's people who find other means. And I mean that sentence purposefully. Like, I think in general, when someone's struggling with mental health or mental health issue, we all need to find some way to cope with that. And I think often addiction becomes one of a variety of ways that people deal with that. And I mean that broadly speaking. So like, for example, sort of like a lot of centers like Bellwood, where I worked before, we acknowledge that there's substance addictions, but there's also other addictions we kind of get into. So things like gambling addiction, sex addiction. I am not an advocate for food addiction, as food being the substance, but the behaviors of an eating disorder are certainly addictive, if that makes sense. And so I think there's all sorts of ways that clinically we tend to call maladaptive coping. So just trying to cope in a way that like actually starts to hurt us in the long run, but feels like it gets us at least through the short term. And I think there's a lot of that. Even if like someone doesn't have mental health, just day to day, like I think the number of people heard trying to cope even with this COVID situation, and they are finding themselves eating differently than normal, consuming substances differently than they normally would, gaming or on their phone differently than they normally would. Like we all have to find ways to cope.
The thing that I struggled with as an addict, I've been addicted to all different kinds of things since I can remember. And the thing that really kept me stuck for so long was thinking addiction. I'm not an addict. Addiction is when you're using heroin, or you're addicted to cocaine, or you're strung out and you've lost your job. I think because our brain is an association machine, we see so much of this in movies. We only know what we're exposed to. So if the conversation of addiction isn't happening in a healthy way in school or in our families, we're really lending to, social media and media, movies, et cetera, to understand what addiction is. So I wasn't looking for help with addiction as somebody who was recreationally using drugs, or addicted to love, addicted to weed, because everybody was like, oh, weed's, it's natural, it's fine, it's non-addictive. So I think the conversation that I'm really eager to have is, how do we make the decision autonomously as to whether we're struggling with addictive behaviors? And I'm going to add a B to that. Once we identify with that, or once we agree, okay, I might be engaging in some addictive behaviors that aren't helpful for my health or healing, how do we not stay tied to that addiction title?
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna answer fluidly. If I miss any part of that, just let me know.
Yeah.
And I'll go back. But I think some of where, like, some of the issue, in my opinion, is that clinicians, like clinically, we on our side have kind of confused this world a lot. So like we have these distinctions between what is addiction, what is substance dependence, what is like all this clinical stuff, right? And so like I think that's where some of this projection has come from, where addiction has to be this very like hard thing. Because I guess technically the term addiction suggests that's true. So a technical addiction means that there's been some sort of biological dependence built on whatever the source of addiction is. So for example, with some substances, they're addictive because if you were to stop using them, you would go through significant withdrawal symptoms. So your body has become dependent on them to the point that you would become very ill if you're no longer exposed to it. Some things provide some chemical change, but much more subtle. So for example, we may not be getting a lot of like the neural juices that like make us feel good because our life has been really hard for a long time. And the only time we feel good is when we use X substance of choice, whether that's a physical substance or gambling, we get that hit of like reward from like that little win. or if it's like love, oh my gosh, talk about like oxytocin release. It's like, yeah, of course we get this hit of something we often very rarely feel in our lives. Are we going to go through withdrawal symptoms? No. Are we at some level still feeling dependent on that object that's giving us that feel good? Yeah. Like we all deserve to feel good. And if we've had either a life or a series of experiences in our life that has taken that away for a duration of time, yeah, of course someone's going to feel pretty addicted to having some pleasure back in their life, some joy, even some peace. Like it doesn't even have to be as extreme as joy, just like some relief from constant, relentless voices of anxiety or depression or whatever it is. And so, yeah, that's kind of addictive, but differently than how we would necessarily term it if someone's not going to have full withdrawal symptoms. So can you be addicted to something like marijuana? Not biologically, but behaviorally, certainly, because I think where people get stuck is when we start to feel dependent on that thing as the thing that's going to make us feel good. So that's the tipping point, is the dependence piece, is when I don't know how to feel good if I don't have X as part of my life. I don't know if I can give it up, because that means a life of like emptiness, anxiety, trauma, depression, whatever it is. I can no longer avoid or escape all that stuff that's going on if I don't have X thing. Particularly if that thing is also going to either get in the way of me ultimately healing and feeling good in a variety of ways in life, or if long-term it could cause harm. So take something as gentle and beautiful and amazing as like yoga. Can some people get addicted to yoga? Potentially. It makes a lot of people feel really good. And if someone starts to use it as a means of, let's say, escaping whatever they feel normally, like starts to become obsessive, starts to feel like I can't not do it or else I'm going to feel bad. Even if I have an injury, I have to do it anyway because I'm going to feel bad. Like you're certainly not going to go through withdrawal symptoms if you can't do it, but that sense of dependence because it's something that you feel like you need to feel good enough, that sense of I have to get away from myself, that sense of long term, I'm going to keep pushing myself, keep aggravating injuries, keep paying for classes that I can't afford, keep, let's say, not getting my schoolwork done because I'm doing so much of it. Like that's what exercise addiction starts to look like, right? Often with some sort of like body change intent in mind too. But I think there's all sorts of different ways to become addicted. But I think the key qualities are there's this deep drive for either some sort of feel good or escape, like some sort of like kind of a bit of an overdriven avoidance behavior because regular life doesn't always feel good. I think that's with the exception of also recognizing that there are some people who can become very biologically addicted to substances. And I don't want to discount that. So some people do just pick up, maybe not yoga, maybe not marijuana, maybe not some of these substances, but some of the substances that have inherently chemical changing properties, and they're biologically sensitive to that. And so everything might be great in their world and they still get addicted. That certainly does happen. And so I don't want to discount that either, but I think there's this like whole category of people that's quite broad where there's something else going on very often, and it serves that other purpose of escape or finding some sort of feel good in a world that generally doesn't, or might even bring a feeling of social acceptance in a world where they rarely felt that before.
Right. Really amazing points. I want to pick up off of that. I want to ask you a question about that after, but the B part of this question, how can we change? Because that label, once an addict, always an addict, I don't love that. I don't love thinking about that as a diagnosis for life. I think my personal perception of it at this point is that, once we learn what are the triggers that are probing us or encouraging us to want to self-soothe with an external source, and we find healthier ways to manage that probe or that trigger, that we can become, a different person, a more, evolved, self-supportive person. What do you think about that?
Yeah. So one of the primary therapies I work from is something called dialectical behavioral therapy. And what you're saying, I agree with. And then it really comes, there's this thing that they call, I think their term for it's so perfect, called avoid avoidance. So if in any way we're trying to escape ourselves, we're trying to escape the pain, we're trying to get out of it, I think some of it is needing to like almost like radically accept that that pain is there and that we can't keep running from ourselves, that we can't keep running, that that's going to become unsustainable and do a lot of harm. And I think that's step one. I think a lot of people take a lot of time to get to that step one of realizing this thing might feel good, but actually seeing the harm it's doing in our life too, even if there's lots of good, right? Or at least stuff that feels good. So I think it's starting to like thicken how we look at some of these behaviors or substances and seeing both its like pros and cons. And then once we can really look at that, and if there's a sense that like this ultimately does harm for me, either in the long term or maybe even short term nowadays, I think it really is about choosing to not avoid anymore. And that's a like at the like step of that, that's a terrifying thing. And so that's like the sum of it, but there's steps to even getting into avoiding avoidance. So some of it is finding other more what we call approach coping skills to balance out avoidance. So, learning things like meditation, or starting to do some DBT groups, or starting to do some sort of reading where you increase the skill set you have to actually go in and heal. And once that skill set to like actually look within increases, people start to do that. And then as this goes up, the need for avoidance to cope goes down, because now you're kind of balancing it. Instead of all avoidance and no approach, it's like you're able to increase the approach, which means you need to avoid less. And I think once you have those skills in place to be able to avoid less, certainly there's more space to pull back or even completely abstain from that substance. And that really depends on the person's relationship to it. So I think even in the substance use and addiction world, there's a lot of debate about harm reduction, which is more of like often more of this, versus abstinence, which kind of says you just stop and then you add that skill, like because of the intensity you're left with. And my experience has been some people do well with that. Like some people need that abrupt end in order to feel the like pain of that enough to be motivated to add those approach skills or to look within or to make real change. And that's okay. And some people aren't going to respond well to that and might need that like replacement type of option where they increase skills first so that they can feel like more ready to let go of whatever the addiction is. And this is all layered with the reality that some people's lives are in a very risky, unsafe place where they don't have the amount of time like to like even stay alive necessarily to do this, in which case they may need to take more drastic measures. And that's okay. That's just a sign. Like there's nothing wrong with being in that. Like you need to like change something quick place. Often it means though that there is a lot of pain, and that's a good sign that someone might just need some help.
Yeah. So it sounds like finding a customized approach with somebody, either a therapist or a team, that can help to, organically figure out what it is that you need in that, detox period. But then also I hear a lot about like neuroplasticity in that, that the brain is so moldable. And that, I think a really empowering thing that somebody said to me once, that I go back to all the time is, I remember them saying, you just have to remember that if you're in a low point or, whatever, a low point, whatever that might be, remember that you won't always live there. It's not going to last forever. And when I look back on that conversation, it's like the brain is just, it'll go wherever you lead it, right? So when you lead it into education, information, support, more health supportive, tools in your daily practices, that the brain starts to live more in those areas and encourage that. that behavior,
Yeah.
those thought patterns, right?
Yeah.
So I think anybody who thinks like, I can't do it, you can. You can 100%.
Totally. And that first step is hard, like really hard, because if you've never, I think you're absolutely right. And it shows like all the amazing like work and openness and realizations you've done. And I think people who have had those glimmers of hope, yes, please hear that message and keep running with it. I think all too often there's been people who've been without that hope for a really long time, and who've genuinely tried change or felt like they've genuinely tried change, and it didn't work out. And often the two reasons for that is that I don't think we always do a good enough job of acknowledging how much inertia is there in the beginning. So absolutely we can steer our brain, but we have to learn how to do that as a first step. And when we're not in the habit of being in the driver's seat of it, the brain is in the habit of driving us. And that's the first thing that the brain has to like rewire, is like the habit of even seeing itself as potentially in the driver's seat. And what happens with that neural wiring, right, is all our old neural wires are like really well walked paths. If anyone's been on like a really well walked trail, it's really obvious, like all the trees and stuff are like away from the trail because so many people are up and down. It's like even the plant life like responds to the reality that this is a channel I go down all the time, right? And our neural pathways do that. If I've always responded to X feeling with Y behavior, that channel is so deeply entrenched, it's going to go really automatically. And what we're essentially trying to do is like, first we have to carve out a new neural pathway. And just like carving out a new trail, it's like we need chainsaws, we need machetes, we need stuff to like literally hack through wild bush to get there the first time. So the first time is incredibly hard. And then we need these like either tools or people or cues in place to remind us like, no, there's this new trail. Don't go down that old one. That old one, we're trying to let that die, right? So we need barriers and stuff to start directing traffic down this new trail. And then once that starts to become entrenched, then it's easy because that's going to be the new normal. But that's a process. And I think what's tricky is that sometimes people expect themselves to just be able to like catch their thought and change it right away. And I think what happens more often is first we make the mistake and then realize it was a mistake. So first we start with just mental rehearsal. We start with just, oh shoot, I did that thing again. How will I change that next time? How did I end up down that path? We reflect back and start to like rehearse the new neural pathway in hindsight. Then we might catch ourselves halfway through the old behavior and need to like shift paths. And then we'll start catching ourselves at the beginning of that trigger and wanting to go down the old path and picking the new one. And so it's like a rollback process more than it is like a really conscious redirection for most people at first. And that's good and normal and fine. And certainly better than the shaming and blaming of ourselves we do if we don't catch ourselves before we do it the first time, or else all hope is lost. And I think very often people put in genuine effort expecting to see change. And what we're not good, even as clinicians, a lot of the time is encouraging the patience around it and that it takes time. I think we so badly want people to be well and to feel better and be safe. There is a sense of urgency around it. And I think especially when safety is in the mix, that's a tricky road to be on, but it's got to start somewhere.
Yeah, and that shame piece, I remember a practitioner saying to me in my 20s, you carry so much shame. And I was like, what? No, I don't. Like, I had no idea.
You're like shamed about your shame. You're like, no, I don't.
Oh God, and it 100%, right? You go home afterward and you ruminate over it and you look at every decision, everything you do in your life and you think, where is this shame? But for me, it was in every thought. It was in how I showed up in relationships and in work and how I dressed and if a guy liked me or not. There was so much shame, and that's that's a symptom of my trauma, and that's so common that we have that shame piece. So if you are hardwired, I mean, I'm learning through Stephen Porges' work right now that, you know, the shame piece is such a common symptom for people. And if we're looking to overcome addictions, or we're looking to work with our addictions, and we are showing up with perfectionism and shame, it's really, this conversation is so important to, you said something once in one of our meditation classes. I think you were quoting somebody else, but you said what the world needs now more than anything is self-compassion.
Mm-hmm.
And that really stuck with me. You know, if you're trying something, that first attempt where you're cutting down the bushes and you're trying to clear that first path, and it's really hard, and maybe you don't make it as far as you planned on that day, to step in with self-compassion and possibly nothing else. How could that feel?
Yeah.
Right?
Well, and the things we do from a place of shame, I mean, addiction inherently comes with shame,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because of the stigmas that you acknowledge and are trying to knock down, as well as so many other facets. Like, ultimately, like, we're doing something that like makes us not feel good in the long term,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so there's some level of even like how our own self-esteem and pride is impacted by that. And something like, especially when it's paired with something like trauma or early childhood traumas or acute trauma or any kind of trauma, like, trauma affects our self-esteem. It affects our sense of power. And so here we are feeling like very powerless beings within this world, and that keep doing things that we ultimately feel are like bad, even for ourselves. And what shame forces us to do, like the natural urge that comes out of shame, is to hide. To like hide, don't show what's actually going on, all this stuff. And the amount of destructive behavior that comes up trying to keep all these things secret is unreal. Like the amount of just damaged relationships, or, you know, like financial debts, or like all these like things that like build up because we're trying to not let anyone see how we actually feel underneath it all. Never mind, the substance use itself is sometimes like an extra reaction to that, or addiction itself is a reaction to that. It's like, I want to hide. It's really hard to hide. The substance or the behavior either helps us with that hiding, or helps us feel better as we cope with all that hiding by ourselves. And we never really get community and support anymore. We never even support ourselves anymore. We're so busy. At some point, we get so busy hiding. There's no room for support. And so that's like, shame is just so toxic when that happens. And the key is to act the opposite, is to start to clean up by coming out of hiding. And it's humbling and it's hard. And there's people where like you need to be able to like trust them enough to be able to do that with them. And there's some people you just might not ever come out in front of. People you should probably question being in your life then. But at some point, that's the way out.
Yeah. So that compassion piece, not only for ourselves, but also as a family member, a friend, or as a partner for somebody who might be struggling with addiction. You know, growing up in a family where addiction is quite prevalent, I have firsthand experience, and in myself as well, in past relationships, this, you know, this anger toward it, and this judgment, this like harshness of, you know, I need you to stop or else, you know. And I think on the receiving end, and also on somebody who's done that to somebody, there is opportunity, in my opinion, for compassion. I know there's a lot of emotion wrapped up in all of that, you know, our needs being met and safety and all of that stuff. But, you know, as somebody who has struggled with, you know, different types of substance abuses, how can we change the narrative around that space between using and not using, where there is some compassion, just some self-love, some understanding,
Yeah.
while we're still using?
Well, I think the thing that people are mistaken about when it comes to self-compassion is, I think we confuse self-compassion with enablement. Like, I think we think of self-compassion or any sort of compassion as enabling and resignation. And I think we really, as a society, don't do a great job of teasing apart emotion from behavior. So we can still expect appropriate, pro-social, helpful behaviors for someone and be really compassionate around their internal experience and how they feel. And I think that's the ticket, is like, oh my gosh, tell me all the things you're feeling, how hard it is. I so feel for you. And we need to get to a point that you're not hurting yourself anymore. And it's like, why can't, like, we're so scared that if we're self-compassionate with the emotion that we're allowing the behavior to happen. And it's like, no, demand appropriate behavior and be really compassionate around the emotions and the experience that's getting in someone's way of getting there, and help to build that. It's like the more validation, like, because the more validation, the more compassion someone gets, they're going to release some of that emotion and shame that's driving the behavior in the first place. So I think that's actually what shows someone how to get to that place that they can let go of the behavior. Is this being self-compassionate with their emotions. They start to sort out this emotional world, and they start to realize they don't need that behavior anymore. And they may still struggle with the habit of it, in which case, like, that's the point where they're usually asking for help and starting to, like, really feel motivated for change themselves, instead of us having to, like, push it.
Yeah.
And so I think that's the ticket, is being self-compassionate with somebody else's feelings and thoughts and inner world, but really still expecting really good behavior from them, for themselves and for the tribe, for society in general.
So for anybody who's watching this and is looking to develop those language skills or reframes within themselves, is there any great books that you can recommend for, or places like websites or anything?
Yeah, so Kristin Neff is the great scholar on self-compassion. So she has a book called Self-Compassion. Neff is Neff, so you can even just look her up in general. Her website also has tools and resources, including activities people can do, journaling exercises, all that kind of stuff, in order to build self-compassion. She also has something now called the Self-Compassion Workbook. So all of them are available online. They're also available digitally. So, like, you don't even have to wait for a delivery to get it. You could start on that, like, right now. I think in the courage and shame piece, there's also a lot that comes from Brene Brown as, like, another scholar. She's got a new podcast out that should really be helpful with that. But any of her books are really good around that. So people could peruse her options. I think, like, as tools, mindfulness meditation really inherently promotes a lot of self-compassionate self-talk. And so if you want, like, a tangible tool or a skill, that's something that people can look into. The Center for Mindfulness Studies in Toronto, which is, I believe, affiliated with CAMH at some level. They have great programs. I think some of them are being offered digitally right now. CAMH has great mindfulness resources and programs available. Mood Disorders of Ontario, the MDAO, Mood Disorders Association of Ontario, has resources, support groups, that kind of stuff available too. So I think those are some good resources to start with. I think in general too, I really love dialectical behavioral therapy. So if people look at, there's a YouTube channel called Borderline Notes. So Marsha Linehan actually had borderline personality disorder, and she's the woman who created dialectical behavioral therapy. And it actually has very specific tools around how to validate your emotions, and like, that even validates what the impact of an invalidating environment is. So I think anything from that, like from Marsha Linehan, anything that says dialectical behavioral therapy is really inherently good at helping people tease apart that behavioral world from the emotional world. And I think that, along with some of the cognitive resources from cognitive behavioral therapy, are really good. Like, that's what we use in addiction treatment. It's like, how do we help when we're teaching people tools? Those are the modalities that we're using. And so there's books and stuff accessible to people. They can be quite clinical, which is why some of those early resources are really helpful. But I think any of those would be really helpful in terms of getting someone through the hump of that, like, self-talk.
Okay. And then as a family member or a partner, somebody who's not struggling with addiction, but in a relationship with somebody who is, how could they possibly develop the language skills or the mindset shifts to support them?
Yeah, I do the same thing. Honestly, I'd be reading Kristin Neff's work. I'd be reading the Brene Brown work. I'd be really making sure, like as a culture in general, we neglect the emotional world. We're
Yeah.
really good with the intellectual world. We appreciate like a lot of action and doing in our society, but we neglect the actual emotional world. And so anything you can do to get more familiar with that. So like self-help books are good, but I think in general, Kristin Neff, Brene Brown are great places to start. They're both going to reference a lot from Tara Brach, as another scholar out there, and she's great, but deals more with the radical acceptance. I think support people might really resonate with that because they also have to radically accept whoever the addicted person is in their world.
Right.
And so I think those are great places. The self-compassion workbook, I think they have to learn to do it to themselves in order to be able to do it for another person. And so I think the more that they can learn how to be really self-compassionate with themselves, you're going to learn how to apply that to someone else. I think another amazing resource is Al-Anon. So Al-Anon is a support group from, I think, the AA world that's for people who have loved ones that are struggling with addiction or like any of the addictions. And so it can be a great support. Like I think caregivers need support too. And so I think anyone who's a carer of someone who is struggling can really benefit from those groups. And again, there's, look up the CAMH website, look up some of these local resources, MDAO, that kind of thing.
MDAO?
Yeah, Mood Disorders Association of Ontario.
Okay.
Yeah, and then the other one too is if their person is involved in some sort of DBT, most of the time wherever they're getting DBT, DBT trained therapists are used to having to train families a little bit too. So if you're doing like Broadview Psychology is an amazing center that deals only in DBT in Toronto. They're awesome. And they have a full DBT program. So some clinicians offer DBT based work, but to do full DBT is a pretty intensive process and it's great. And it's a requirement for the family to be involved. And the parents or the family members also go to skills sessions to learn the DBT skills. And so someone could download or order the DBT workbooks off Amazon and stuff and learn those skills themselves and then apply them because that's what real DBT would look like anyway.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
So, when we're thinking about or talking about, this initial phase of acknowledging that addiction might be a thing for us, acknowledging that somebody in our family or relationships, how do we initiate the steps toward making that courageous move toward healing? We covered a lot of really amazing space there. Thank you. Now, a little bit far, and maybe not farther for everybody, but a little bit farther down the line where we start to learn about attachment theories. So I'm gonna pull like a ball here of yarn that's all like in my head right now and just try and make sense of it. So when I think about some of the massive triggers that I see in the world and also very much within myself is attachment styles. So okay, how can I pair this in? So right now I'm studying a ton on the polyvagal theory. And because I work so much with the gut-brain connection. So when we understand what's happening in the brain, what's happening in the gut, why we have infections, why they don't clear, et cetera, right? So I talk a lot about dorsal vagal, mobilization state, all of these three different states. When I think about dorsal vagal state, so more of that fawn-like state where we're frozen, right? We have this, it's, you see animals do it in nature. When they feel like they're under threat, they freeze. And it's a defense mechanism that's part of our reptilian programming. It's an old branch of the nervous system. Now, it also, in my experience, lends to depression. Mm-hmm. And, when we think about depression and addiction, oftentimes we're looking for ways to upregulate, right? So we're sick of feeling like, oh, just always kind of in this fog, and you're looking for ways to kind of pull yourself up and feel again, right? So when we're looking at relationships and the role that love addiction can play in our desire to kind of pull out of a more depressive state, I think about, okay, let's talk about what it's like to be depressed or in that fawn-like state and want love and connection, not always in the healthiest way, to upregulate. And then see how I'm trying to make sense of it all? And then developing the communication skills, the boundaries, the mindset shifts to protect ourselves from the toxic relationships that create this up and down regulation where we're just always on this roller coaster, right? Because a lot of times if we're just looking at the substance itself, it's like substance abuse itself is in my opinion not always enough. There are many people addicted to many things, including love, toxic love. So what do you think about that?
I think love addiction is complicated on a variety of fronts. I certainly think that freeze fawn state is important in part of it. And so what I mean there is I sometimes split out, like I tend to look at some of Pete Walker's work, and I personally split out that freeze state from the fawn state. So the freeze state being one survival mechanism, and the fawn being the like trying to people please ahead of time to prevent any sort of like threat from coming into my world in the first place. And both are attachment related for sure. I think in general with attachment theory, like if I was to brush some broad strokes, human beings are designed as social animals, right? And what we know is that when we feel like a sense of social safety, okay, so when we feel a secure attachment, or we feel secure in our attachment, we are like have less reactive behavior, okay? So I think in general with love addiction is sometimes someone's baseline attachment style. So if someone's very anxious or very avoidant and basically insecure, they never quite feel that sense of like real social safety and stability. There is this like seeking for it because it is like a core human need, right? And so it can both influence depression. Like sometimes people feel depressed because they feel like they don't have that in their life, right? Or they feel rejectable, or they feel unworthy of true love in some way. And yet at the same time, when they go out and seek it, it's like they're so scared of like love that like it both feels good, but there's this always like scanning from where it's going to go wrong, right? And so there can be either inadvertently self-sabotaging behavior that comes from that. There can be a like overload of like trying to please the partner to keep them that comes from that. There can be like all sorts of behaviors that don't really feel very good that come from that. And so what's tricky about love addiction is that like our need for social safety is true and real. How we believe that that's achievable tends to be really tricky. And when we're in a constant state, like a biological state of never quite feeling that ability to relax, because there's not that secure sense of like partnership or tribe there to like feel like we have a foundation to relax into, that can really keep someone in a perpetual state of being activated a lot. And what we know from trauma is Dan Siegel has a great model called window of tolerance, where essentially there's like a window of emotion we can tolerate. And then above it, we feel like a lot of extreme emotion. And below it, we go into that really frozen, what we call hypo aroused state. So like numbed out, shut down, that kind of like what depression looks like. And with someone with any sort of traumas, but including interpersonal traumas, right? So attachment related traumas, that window shrinks. And so we're more likely to spend more of our time really activated or numbed out and jumping between the two. So you can imagine someone who's had a lot of like interpersonal related trauma or has insecure attachment, a really insecure attachment style. they never feel like they have like a lot of room to tolerate the things that happen within the relationship. They're going to be really quickly jumping into feeling too much and then numbing out, and then jumping into feeling too much and then numbing out, because the body can only be so activated for so long. And they're so scared of relationship or the world or whatever it is that it's hard not to be in that. And so love addiction is tricky because we're dealing with some basic stuff. And then there is also the neurochemical component, right? Someone feeling really depressed is looking for that reward again, that oxytocin, those like reward centers to light up, which love gives us, right? And so, and it's a relatively socially acceptable way to try and feel better, right? Is find love, find a partner. We see it in movies all the time, right? So it's tricky.
Yeah. I could talk to you for days. Days. Oh, it's a lot, but this is such an amazing, amazing conversation. And I hope, I think people, you gave so many great resources and so much insight into this topic. So, it's one that's obviously near and dear to my heart. And I've always appreciated the kernels of wisdom that you drop.
That's so funny.
Always. So thank you. Jo, how can people find you?
So they can search Kernel of Wisdom. I'm on all the various social media sites and just my website on Google. So it's kernelofwisdom.com. All my contact information is on there. You can search Kernel of Wisdom on Instagram, YouTube, Facebook, that stuff, if that's more comfortable for people. But I'm on there.
Yep. And you've got great guided meditations on your YouTube channel that I just absolutely love sending clients to. So thank you for developing that. Mm-hmm. Thank you for your time. I love you dearly.
Yeah, thank you. It's so great to be here.
Yeah, it was great. Guys, I'm going to post a link to the donation link for CAMH in the description box. And anything that you feel called to donate is super appreciated. CAMH was the hospital that helped to rehabilitate me last year after a very public nervous breakdown, but led me to a world of healing and understanding and self-compassion. So thank you for being with us today. And Jo, I hope to see you soon. In the flesh.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye.